Hebrews chapter 12, it gives us the practical application. How do you deal with sin in your life? Hebrews 12:1 says, therefore, since we have such a large cloud of witnesses surrounding us, that's people in the generations before who have lived by faith and been faithful. He says, because we have all of this, let us lay aside, put down every hindrance, every weight, every burden, and the sin that so easily ensnares us. So here's the first thing he says to do. What is the stuff in your life that's weighing you down, keeping you from being free in Christ? Maybe it's an addiction or a stronghold. Maybe it's priorities that become idols and you didn't mean them for that be that way, and then they become idols and you realize, oh man, this is becoming a greater priority than Christ in my life. I can list a number of things. But he says, let us lay aside all the weight and the sin that so easily ensnares us, it entraps us. So what in your life is weighing you down that's keeping you from following Christ? What sin in your life is weighing you down and keeping you from following Christ? And then after you lay those things aside, you've got to name them, you've got to confess them before Christ. Then he says, let us run with endurance, because you can't run a race. You can't run a marathon if you've got 100 pounds on your back, can you? And this life is a marathon. This life is not a sprint. It seems like a long time depending on how far you're into the journey. But he says, let us run with endurance the race that lies before us. And here's what we do. After we get rid of the sin and the weight that holds us down and ensnares us, we keep our eyes where? On Jesus. We keep our eyes on Jesus. He's the source and the perfecter. Some translations say the author and the finisher. Some translations say the pioneer and the perfecter, the beginning and the end of our faith. That's an amazing thing. One of the things I've seen about some of the best trained dogs, I love dogs. I don't have one right now. They've broken my heart every time they pass, so we don't have one right now. But I love dogs. But what I've watched over the years is some of the most well-trained dogs. Do you know what they do when their master's around? They keep their eyes on their master. They don't look at the food that's on the ground that they'd like to get, right? They keep their eyes on the master, keeps their eyes off their temptation of that piece of meat that just fell on the ground or whatever other temptation to go and run after the squirrel, whatever it may be. They keep their eyes on the master, and then the master gives them direction. While obviously we're much greater value than any animal, maybe also we should keep our eyes on our master. Because the sin and the weight easily besets us, so we get rid of that, keep our eyes on Jesus, the beginning and the end of our faith, the pioneer of our faith, the perfecter of our faith. And here's why. Here's what Jesus did in Hebrews 12:2 at the end of that verse. For the joy that lay before him. Jesus realized that in the end there was greater joy than anything Satan had to offer him in those 40 days. Those things that Satan offered Jesus were real. While they were half-truths and mixed with lies, there was immediate gratification in those moments, in each of those three. And so here's what Jesus did. For the joy that lay before him, he endured the cross. He said, I'm going to lay aside jumping off the temple. I'm going to lay aside being king of the natural world. I'm going to lay aside the temporary pleasure of using my power to turn stone into bread. He says, because I'm going to get all authority when I endure the cross. Because the Father wants me to do this for all believers. And so for the joy that lay before him, he endured the cross. What did he do? He despised the shame. That's a weird word in our context. What does it mean he despised the shame? Here's what it means literally. He belittled. He diminished the pain. He diminished the shame. He says, yes, I know I'm going to be shamed. I'm going to be stripped almost naked. I'm going to be beaten. I'm going to be humiliated. I'm going to be laid out upon a cross to die the most humiliating death. He says, but I'm just belittling that shame, because of the joy that still laid before him. And then what? He sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. And so today, my friends, if you're in Christ, you can overcome every temptation in your life. Why? Because Jesus tells us in Hebrews 4:14 that he's a compassionate high priest. Why is Jesus the compassionate high priest? Because remember, the priest is the one that goes to God for us. That God the Son is a compassionate high priest. You know why? Because Hebrews 4:14, 15, and 16 tells us that he was tempted. He has been tempted in every way as we have been, yet without sin. So my friends, whenever you're tempted and your faith is weak and your strength is small and your stress is high, when you come to God, He understands. You're praying to the one true God who understands everything you've been to. So when you come to Him, look at verse 16 of Hebrews 4. He says, let us approach the throne of grace with boldness. You know, in ancient times, somebody just flippantly coming before the king, that was a no-go. But God tells us as His children, we can boldly come to His throne of grace so that we can receive mercy and find grace to help us in time of need. So my friends, today, you know what it means to come to the throne of grace boldly? It means you bow in prayer wherever you're at. Wherever that temptation comes, whenever you're struggling with, hey, look at me and my pride, or hey, in pride, hey, my pain, this is who I am. Or hey, I can achieve this, or I can do this in my own power. This is the way it needs to be done. Instead of waiting and looking for what Christ and His Word has to say, Jesus says you can come to Him, the compassionate high priest, because He understands everything you've gone through, yet He did it without sin. So I encourage you, my friends, cry out to Him. Let Him give you victory in the here and the hereafter.